Let's compare Enuma Elish with the biblical text. Comparison of Enuma Elish and various considerations. When the sky was not named at the top, and below the land had no name, the primordial ocean, Apsu, his father, and the tumultuous Tiamat, the mother of all, its waters merged into one, and no fields were formed, nor were swamps seen, when none of the gods had been called into existence. Here we have the initial text of the poem Enuma Elish. This poem refers the creation to a relationship between Apsu and Tiamat. So the system of the poem is that it needs a relationship to form something. Another consideration is the existence of two primordial personifications. It is the characteristic that gods are forces of nature. Beyond the polytheistic ideology. Analysis positions. R1. Comparison rule. When there are two texts and one is more concise and explanatory than the other, there is a greater probability that the concise is original. R2. When in two texts one is involved in a common culture and linked to the normal thinking of different cultures, and another text with the same connections has a unique and different thought of the cultural principle of the region inserted, such text is the most likely to be true. R3. When in two texts one is more mythological than the other, the least mythological is probably the original. Vision at the alien point. Does an alien man and woman come to Earth have a relationship and leave offspring? But here the text says that the forces of nature did not exist. Did the aliens create nature? If they created nature, why relationship to form a descendant? The alien view through the analyzed text loses a real sense. It is devoid of a rational line of thought, since it generates dualistic concepts between limitations and unlimited. Biblical comparison. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and there was darkness on the face of the deep, but the Spirit of God was on the face of the waters. Gen 1:1-2. We will now determine T1 poetry by Enuma Elish, and T2 biblical text. Using R1 over T1 and T2, we have that T2 is more concise and explanatory than T1. For example, in T2 we have that God created a form superior to natural human actions. In T1 we have a relationship between two beings, a form limited to human similarity. In T2 we have the creation of the heavens and the earth, without the ideology that such are gods. In T1 the forces of nature comprise gods. Both T1 and T2 cite the existence of a place full of water and without form, but T2 situates this place without forms on earth, and in T1 without forms in the entire universe. In T2 determines the previous creation, and the later creation, determining a creation not involved in water, and another one involved in water. We must understand that Spirit of God in the verse of T2, is not idealized as another entity, as Tiamat in T1. The formation of the Trinitarian idea of the 3rd century is not the ideology of this Hebrew text. Here the term Rach Elohim, it is not the breath of God, but the breath of God, since T1 represents the gods as waters, and in T2 God is not represented by any object. In T2 God is not a form capable and visible in existence. Thus for R1, the text T2 is the most reliable report, than T1. The origin of divine concepts and communities is the connection of forces of nature to divine entities. This is the standard form of all religions. This is how polytheism is formed, since the diverse forces of nature are divinalized. So in T1 we have the forces of nature becoming divine. Such concepts are normal in regions near or far from Samaria. When a text is culturally different from the region in which it is read, this region usually changes its content to suit your way of thinking. Thus, a text inserted in a community tends to change over the years to suit the community. Thus T1, the regional Semitic community, is suitable. But T2 is not a text suitable for the Semitic community. Thus T2 managed to get rid of regional concepts more than T1. Thus for R1, the text T2 is the most reliable report, than T1. The text of T1 is full of mythological concepts and divine references, with heroic stories of wars, and creations of wars. Formation of epic wars, like Tiamat, and the fight with Marduk, fights pertinent to human actions, involved swords, arrows and other things. So weapons serve to kill gods. So T1 has much more mythology than T2. Thus for R1, the text T2 is the most reliable report, than T1. Copy concept. Here the question would be, was T1 copied from T2 or T2 copied from T1? If we read the two texts carefully, we see that neither T1 copied from T2, nor T2 copied from T1. What we have is an initial story with two paths of passage. Imagine the game in which a person speaks a text and quickly sends two lines to pass the information to the last of each line. So we have that the message of T1 and T2 came from the same original story. Since if T2 had copied from T1, we would have at least the war factor contained in T1, and we did not find the fundamental factor of T1 in T2. The text of T1 could have been a culturally modified copy to suit the Semitic culture, but the text of T1 is earlier than the text of T2. Therefore, there is no possibility that one of the texts has copied from the other. But between the two texts, the one that comes closest to the original story by the rules exposed is the text by T2. Therefore, the biblical text is not a copy of the Sumerian text, and yet the biblical text is the closest to the account of the history relevant to the two texts. Many people use the text of Enuma Elish to say that the early part of the Bible's Genesis comes from this text. What does not happen? We can see parallels because the ideology of a Messiah is paralleled by Marduk, a history of Messiah, and the Savior against Tiamat. When we read the Bible, we read that a Messiah would come to destroy the serpent. The question is, which messianic story is the original? Marduk to kill Tiamat, or the Messiah to destroy the serpent? If Marduk and Tiamat come first, then Genesis could not determine the Messiah for the future, since Marduk's coming and the victory over Tiamat already describe how it happened, and in Genesis not. What is the primary story? The one that has no chapters after a future plot. In other words, Genesis predates the history of Marduk and Tiamat, and the coming of the Messiah in the Roman period. If we use the techniques of comparative thematic analysis, we would see that in textual content the report in Genesis would be considered the most realistic, and therefore the most primordial of the reports.
If you are looking for more content from different areas, visit the reformadorstazad.com website. News and detailed content can be found. With system of research and organization of text and video.